Hi, folks. In our third week, we're looking more closely at key studies within sociology of race and ethnic relations. And with that in mind, there are key researchers that we're looking at this week whose studies have been groundbreaking and timely with respect to helping us have a deeper understanding of the social consequences ultimately of what we consider to be race and what we consider to be ethnicity in the United States. And so we're talking chiefly about sociologists Dalton Conley, Massey and Denton, as well as William Julius Wilson. One of the key outcomes of these folk studies, in a lot of respects, is the understanding that race is ultimately a spatial phenomenon in the United States. So when we're talking about it from a spatial aspect, we're looking at really, well, where do we live? And how do we live? And who lives around us? And so, in a lot of respects, a lot of the key core work of Massey and Denton looking at racial residential segregation and the growth of that and the enormity of the concentrations of that, a lot of what they're demonstrating with that social demography ultimately is that race often is about who's around you and who isn't. So typically in our society, we live next to someone who is of the same race or ethnicity as we ourselves are. Obviously, there are many exceptions, but when we look at what we call in sociology the segregation index or the index of dissimilarity, that's another term for it. Typically, the vast majority of U.S. citizens would have to move or reshuffle in some way to be around what we would consider a fairly expected mix for the racial and ethnic distribution that we have in our society. So, if you think about it, race matters less as a concept if we all live in the same places and if we all attend the same schools. So, when we look at the modern era, particularly in our metropolitan United States, and the vast majority of U.S. citizens live in metropolitan areas. They live either in a city or the suburban parts of that particular area. Outside the city, again, the vast majority of us live in some kind of very segregated space. There are some exceptions. Certain metros, for instance, are a bit more integrated, particularly if those towns are near a college or a university, as well as the military, because those are the kinds of institutions that tend to break down a lot of the racial barriers that we've seen erected in other aspects of society. They tend to kind of bring people together. But again, the vast majority of U.S. citizens do not live in some sphere of influence around a military installation or around a college or a university that has a traditional kind of land grant presence, being the dominant employer and institution in town. All right, so we also have to keep in mind that race is about access to what resources. So again, it's also about where you live and what's around you. And this became abundantly clear during the pandemic when we had a lot of effectively shelter in place and stay at home orders to protect our health and well being. So, in a lot of respects, when we think about having to hunker down in a very small geographic radius, certain, if you will, neighborhoods, certain areas of our metro regions were more vulnerable, were much more likely to have residents who struggled in one way or another. And often that struggle is deeply embedded in the lack of resources in certain communities. A big part of what makes race matter in our society and what makes race matter for a lot of our communities, particularly during the pandemic, we observed this, is the pattern of disinvestment. So we have, as a country, as a government, as a series of government entities, we have great latitude with respect to where we put our money, where we put our resources, and where we invest. And we typically see investments over time having been shifted away from communities of color, particularly African American and Latinx communities, and to ultimately mainstream white society. So, again, a lot of what we assume in terms of how we live and where we live and who lives next to us and who doesn't and who we know as a part of our community and who isn't, we often are led to think that these are sort of natural arrangements and, well, that's just the way it is. But vastly, these are the product and the outcome of political and economic decisions. And a lot of that goes back to the great work of Omi and Winat with respect to racial formation. So we have to think about that. Again, ultimately, race is about access to what resources, to what quality of schools, what quality of city or suburban services, for instance, what quality of life, if people feel safe walking up and down the street at any point in time of the day. Are they adjacent to or in proximity to shopping, to parks and recreational facilities, things that would actually help ultimately enhance their lives? So overwhelmingly, we've seen that white folks have had much greater access to capital accumulation, wealth accumulation, as well as neighborhoods that are safer, neighborhoods that are thriving, and communities that have a lot of resources. And so the pressures of very stressful kinds of circumstances, particularly that which we saw during the pandemic, intensify some of the so-called neighborhood effects that we can observe. And so conversely, for a lot of black and brown folks, the challenges during the pandemic, unique to the pandemic, exacerbated ongoing disinvestment in a lot of the communities that they live in. And so we're talking about how vibrant a neighborhood is, how vibrant a town is, versus whether or not that town has been or that neighborhood has been disinvested in. So again, disinvestment, if you think about it, is a fancy way of saying, okay, we're going to pull resources away from certain communities and out of certain communities, not let them come back in again as much, and then we're going to prioritize other kinds of communities. And so where we tend to prioritize and put our efforts and our money, we tend to see those communities as being more vibrant, and the research indicates that these communities are overwhelmingly white, middle class, and wealthy. So we're also talking about who has access to capital and who has access to resources, who has access to money and funds for investments and financiers, and to grow and start and develop their own businesses within their own communities. So a lot of what we're talking about also within sociology is known as life chances. We're talking about the experiences that one can expect to have in a given social context. And again, we're talking about race being spatial, being geographic, again, where you live and who lives next to and near you, but also about resources. What kinds of things can I do within my community? What quality of life can I expect to have and to inherit based upon living in this particular community? So again, a lot of what you'll see in the work of Conley, William Julius Wilson, Massey and Denton, this week's core of key studies and sociologists, will dovetail a lot with our discussion of the spatial nature and characteristics of race, as well as the access-based characteristics of race as well.